Hey there. Tonight we're stepping away from the grand narratives of conquest and glory, away from the gleaming armour and towering castles. We're walking into the shadows of history, into the muddy corners where most people lived and died without leaving so much as a name carved in stone. We're talking about medieval peasants and the egregious times they endured. Not just hardship, that's too gentle a word. We're talking about cruelty, both deliberate and casual. Suffering both swift and grinding, injustices so commonplace they became the very air people breathed. If this kind of quiet, contemplative history helps you unwind at the end of a long day, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all sharing this same quiet moment across different places and time zones. So settle in, turn down the lights, maybe put on a fan for that gentle background hum. Let's begin in a place that time forgot, or perhaps deliberately ignored. This village has no name worth remembering. It sits in a fold of land so unremarkable that even the most detailed maps would leave it blank. A depression in the earth just deep enough to catch rain and misery in equal measure. The trees press close, not protectively, but like they're trying to crowd out whatever hope might take root here. The fields stretch in crooked patches, carved by generations of bent backs and borrowed time. You were born here, not by choice but by circumstance. Your parents were born here too, and their parents before them, stretching back in an unbroken line of people who never had anywhere else to go. The world beyond these hills exists only in rumours and half-remembered stories told by travellers who might have been lying anyway. The houses sag under the weight of their own existence. Wattle and daub walls patched with whatever the wind hasn't stolen yet. Mud, straw, sometimes strips torn from old clothing when there was nothing else. The roofs are thatch, but calling it thatch is generous. It's more like organised decay, layers of straw slowly returning to earth one storm at a time. Everything here smells of damp and resignation. Wet wool turned earth, the sour breath of animals kept too close to humans, the acrid smoke of fires that never quite catch properly. It's the smell of making do, of surviving another day in a world that seems actively hostile to the idea. The track that passes for a road is just two ruts worn by ox carts, filled with water that never quite drains and reflects nothing but grey sky. No one important has used this road in living memory. Important people have better roads that lead somewhere worth going. Time moves differently here. Not slowly, that would imply leisure. It moves heavily, like syrup in winter, each moment thick with the weight of what must be endured. You don't measure days by clocks or calendars, but by the depth of shadows, the ache in your spine, the number of times you've had to repatch the same hole in the roof. There are perhaps 15 families here, enough to fill a small church if there were one nearby. Everyone knows everyone's business because privacy is a luxury for people who have walls that actually block sound. You know who beats their wife, who drinks too much ale, whose children go hungry so the parents can eat. You know, and you say nothing, because tomorrow it might be you. The village elder, Thomas the Bent, earned his authority by being the last one left from the previous generation. He remembers when things were different, though he can never quite explain how they were better. His house leans at an angle that seems to defy gravity, much like his stories. But no one challenges either because Thomas has outlived 3 lords and 2 plagues. That counts for something. There are no written records here. Boundaries exist in the space between memory and argument, settled by whoever shouts loudest or lasts longest. If there's a dispute, it's handled with the kind of weary resignation that comes from knowing there's no higher authority worth appealing to. The Lord Steward comes through twice a year with his ledgers and his questions, but he doesn't settle arguments between peasants. That's beneath his notice. No one leaves. Not really. Oh, sometimes a young man might set off claiming he'll find work in the next village or seek his fortune on the road. More often than not, he comes back within a fortnight, hungrier and quieter than when he left. Those who don't return aren't spoken of much. The forest has ways of keeping secrets. The idea of travel belongs to other people, with coin and connections, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to wonder, where your next meal will come from. You've heard of cities, of course, places where buildings stretch 3 stories high and streets are paved with actual stones. But these are stories like dragons or talking animals, interesting to hear about, impossible to believe. What would you do in such a place anyway? You can't read, you've never held a silver coin. You don't know the customs or the language beyond your own rough dialect. The city would chew you up and spit you out like a piece of gristle, and no one would even notice you were gone. So you stay, not because you love this place, love requires choice, but because it's the only world that knows your name. Here, you understand which sounds mean danger and which mean merely inconvenience. You know where to find water when the well runs dry, which neighbours might share a crust when times are desperate, which patches of sky warn of storms. You wake when the light comes, not because you've had enough sleep, but because there's work to do and daylight is precious. You sleep when darkness falls, not because you're tired. You're always tired, but because candles are expensive and firelight is needed for cooking, not reading books you couldn't understand anyway. This is your world, 60 paces from the house where you were born to the field where you'll likely die. It's small, yes, and hard, and often cruel, but it's yours. And in a world where most people own nothing at all, even a corner of suffering can feel like home. The rhythm here is simple. Survive today, worry about tomorrow when it comes, remember yesterday only long enough to learn from its mistakes. You don't dream of better days, because dreams are for people who have the luxury of disappointment. You focus on the ground beneath your feet, the tools in your hands, the breath in your lungs. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between the endless tasks, you feel something that isn't quite contentment, but isn't despair either. A recognition, perhaps, of your place in the long line of people who have bent their backs to this same soil, who have patched the same leaking roofs, who have made the same thin stew stretch through the same hungry nights. You are not the first to live this way, and you won't be the last. And there's a strange comfort in that continuity, in being part of something larger than your own small struggles. The world may not know your name, but the earth remembers your footsteps. The fields remember your hands, and that, perhaps, is enough. In your lifetime, you will walk thousands of miles, but all of them will be circles within circles, paths worn smooth by the endless repetition of necessary tasks. The average medieval peasant lived and died within a radius of 5 miles, not from lack of curiosity or ambition, but because the world beyond was not designed for people like you. Travel was not adventure, it was catastrophe. Roads were not conveniences, but hazards. Muddy tracks through forests where bandits waited and wild animals hunted. There were no maps, no signs, no inns for people who couldn't pay, just vague directions passed mouth to mouth. Follow the stream until you see the lightning-struck oak, then turn toward the hill that looks like a sleeping woman. If you got lost, you stayed lost. There was no one coming to find you. Your family might wonder where you'd gone, but wondering doesn't fill an empty belly or tend an untended field. Life moved on without you, because it had to. The forests were not the tame woodlands of fairy tales, but dense, ancient places that seemed to breathe with their own malevolent life. Trees so thick their canopy blocked the sun even at midday. Undergrowth that caught at your clothes and skin like grasping fingers. Sounds you couldn't identify echoing from directions you couldn't pinpoint. Bears still roamed these woods, and wolves and men who had chosen to live outside the law because the law had nothing to offer them. A lone traveller was an easy target, especially if they looked like they might have something worth taking. And something worth taking could be as little as a decent pair of boots or a loaf of bread. Even if you survived the journey, arrival brought its own problems. Strangers were not welcomed with open arms, but with suspicion and sometimes hostility. Disease followed travellers, so did trouble. A village that had achieved a fragile stability was not eager to upset that balance for the sake of someone else's problems. You spoke differently than they did, even if you were only from the next valley over. You held your knife wrong, tied your shoes wrong, pronounced words in ways that marked you as an outsider. Children stared, adults whispered. You might be allowed to sleep in a barn if you paid for the privilege, but you wouldn't be invited to share a meal or warm yourself by the fire. And what if you did reach your destination? What if you found that distant city with its stone buildings and paved streets? You would stand at its gates with nothing to offer, knowing no one, speaking a dialect that marked you as rural, poor, ignorant. The city would swallow you whole and leave no trace. Better to stay home, where at least the misery was familiar. Here, you knew which part of the roof would leak when the wind came from the west. You knew which neighbour might lend you a tool without asking too many questions. You knew the names of the local saints and which ones were most likely to listen to prayers from someone like you. The village might be small and poor and often hungry, but it was yours. You had helped build its fences, dig its wells, bury its dead. Your sweat was mixed into its soil. Your voice was part of its evening prayers. You belonged here in a way you would never belong anywhere else. Sometimes merchants passed through, their carts loaded with goods from distant places, salt from the coast, iron from the mountains, cloth dyed in colours you had no names for. They told stories of great cities and wealthy lords, of markets that sold spices and books and things you couldn't even imagine. You listened to these stories with the same attention you might give to tales of distant stars. Interesting, yes, but so far removed from your reality that they might as well be fiction. What use was it to know about pepper when you couldn't afford salt? What good did it do to hear about books when you couldn't read your own name? The merchants themselves were different creatures from you. They moved with the confidence of people who belonged everywhere and nowhere. They spoke multiple dialects, carried letters of credit, knew the roads like you knew the paths between your house and your field. They lived in motion while you lived in stillness. When they left, they took their stories with them, leaving behind only the memory of voices that spoke of a larger world. And you would return to your work, mending thatch, feeding pigs, stirring the endless pot of stew, with the knowledge that somewhere beyond the forest, life moved at a different pace, to a different rhythm. But you didn't envy them, not really. Their lives might be broader than yours, but they were also more dangerous, more uncertain. They slept in a different place every night, never knowing if they would be welcomed or robbed or simply ignored. They had no neighbours to help when trouble came, no familiar faces to share their burdens. You had roots, even if they grew in poor soil. You had continuity, even if it was the continuity of hardship. You had a place in the world, even if that place was small and muddy and largely forgotten by history. And so you stayed, not from cowardice but from wisdom. You understood that the devil you knew was preferable to the devils you didn't. You tended your small corner of the world with the patience of someone who knew that this corner was all you would ever have and all you really needed. The world might be vast and full of wonders, but wonders were for other people. You had work to do. Your house is not built so much as assembled from whatever materials the landscape reluctantly provides. There is no blueprint, no master plan, just the simple need for shelter wrestling with the equally simple fact that nature would prefer you didn't have any. You begin with what you can find or cut or borrow, rough-hewn timbers that are more suggestion than straight line, their bark still clinging in places like they're not quite ready to be lumber yet. The frame goes up crooked because the ground isn't level and your tools aren't precise, and frankly, perfection is a luxury you can't afford. Between the posts you weave thin branches and flexible twigs in a process called wattling. It's tedious work that leaves your fingers raw and bleeding, but it creates a framework that will hold together long enough to matter. The weave doesn't have to be beautiful, just functional, though the distinction between the two becomes academic when you're working with materials that would rather be left alone. Then comes the daubing, mud mixed with straw, animal dung and whatever else might help it stick together. You slap it on with your bare hands, pressing it into the gaps, smoothing it as best you can with tools that are really just sticks with opinions. The smell is overwhelming at first, earthy, animal, honest in the way that only truly necessary things can be honest. It dries slowly and unevenly, cracking in some places, sagging in others. You patch what you can and ignore what you can't because the alternative is starting over with materials you don't have and time you can't spare. Eventually you stop noticing the cracks. They become part of the landscape, like everything else that's slightly broken but still functional. The roof is your ongoing battle with gravity and weather, layer upon layer of dried straw, reeds if you can find them, tied and woven and pressed together in the hope that water will flow over it rather than through it. When it's fresh, it gleams golden in the sunlight, almost pretty from a distance. Then the rains come and the birds come, and time comes with its slow, patient erosion. Holes appear where you least expect them. The peak sags under its own weight. Whole sections slide off during storms and have to be rebuilt from whatever thatch you can salvage. You develop an intimate knowledge of your roof's moods, which areas leak first, which patches hold longest, where to place the buckets when the weather turns. There is no floor, just earth packed down by years of walking, sweeping, spilling, living. In dry weather, it's almost solid. When it rains, it turns to mud that squishes between your toes and clings to everything you own. You spread rushes or straw to cover it, creating a carpet of sorts that smells of grass and slowly decomposing organic matter. Windows are holes in the wall covered by wooden shutters that swing on leather hinges and never quite close properly. Glass is for churches and the homes of people who have never had to choose between eating and staying warm. The wind comes in, and the cold and sometimes rain and occasionally small animals looking for somewhere warmer than the forest. The door hangs crooked because the frame settled during the first winter and everything shifted slightly to the left. It closes with a wooden latch that keeps the chickens out and makes you feel slightly safer, though safety is relative when your walls are made of mud and your roof is mostly hope. Inside, space is communal by necessity. One room, maybe two if someone managed to add a lean-to or partition off a corner, but usually just one where you sleep, eat, cook, argue, make peace, tell stories, and try to stay warm. Everyone lives here. Parents, children, a grandparent too old to work but too stubborn to die, maybe a cousin whose own house collapsed last winter. The hearth sits in the centre, built of stones if you were lucky enough to find good ones, clay and hope if you weren't. The fire burns constantly because letting it go out means starting over with flint and tinder and more patience than you usually have. Smoke rises through a hole in the roof, more or less. There's no chimney because chimneys are for people who can afford to hire someone else to build them. The air inside is always hazy, always carrying the scent of whatever's been cooking, burning or slowly mouldering in the corners. Your eyes water constantly for the first few months, then adapt. Your clothes, your hair, your skin, everything carries the smell of smoke mixed with the particular funk of people who live too close together and don't bathe often enough. Furniture is what you can make or trade for. A table that's really just boards laid across stumps, benches that wobble, stools that tip over if you lean the wrong way. There might be a chest for storing your few valuable possessions, extra clothes, tools, maybe a cup that hasn't been cracked yet. Beds are wooden frames strung with rope or leather, stuffed with straw that needs changing more often than you change it, covered with blankets that are always slightly damp. Privacy doesn't exist. Everyone sleeps in the same space, listening to each other breathe, snore, cough, whisper prayers or curses into the darkness. Storage happens in the rafters. Bundles of herbs, strings of onions, maybe a ham if the pig was generous that year. You can tell the season by what's hanging above your head, full in autumn, increasingly bare as winter stretches toward spring. Sometimes you lie awake calculating how many meals are left in those shadowy bundles. Animals share your space because they need warmth and you need their body heat. A cow in the corner, chickens roosting in baskets, a goat that knows its name and comes when called. The smell is complicated, not pleasant exactly, but familiar. You learn to breathe through your mouth when necessary and appreciate the practical benefits of shared warmth. Nothing is level, nothing is square, nothing is quite the colour it started out being. The whole structure breathes with the seasons, expanding and contracting, settling and shifting. You fix what you can with whatever materials you can find or make. You ignore what you can't fix. You adapt to the quirks and compromises and call them character. When visitors see your home, they see poverty. You see resourcefulness. A roof that keeps out most of the rain most of the time. Walls that block most of the wind most of the year. A fire that burns and a space that's yours. It's not much, but it's enough. And in a world where enough is often more than most people have, that's a kind of wealth. You lie down each night surrounded by the sounds of your life, family breathing, animals settling, the fire crackling, the wind testing the thatch. It's not quiet, and it's not comfortable, but it's home. And when morning comes, you wake up in the same place you went to sleep, surrounded by the same people ready to face another day of small repairs and large hopes. The house bends, but it doesn't break. It leaks, but it doesn't fall down. It's crooked, but it stands. And so do you. For the medieval peasant, food wasn't sustenance so much as a daily puzzle with too few pieces. You didn't plan meals. You solved the problem of eating with whatever materials were available, which was usually less than you needed and rarely what you wanted. Your kitchen, such as it was, occupied the corner of your single room nearest the hearth. There were no shelves lined with ingredients, no pantry stocked with staples, just a few clay pots, wooden bowls that had been carved by hands you'd never know, and the eternal mystery of what might be edible among the things you could actually obtain. At the centre of your culinary universe lived the pottage pot, a vessel that never truly emptied and never completely started fresh. It was more like a living thing that you fed and tended, and hoped wouldn't develop any flavours that might kill you. Whatever went into the pot stayed there, transforming into something that was warm and filling, and bore only a passing resemblance to its individual components. On good days, pottage might contain cabbage, onions, beans that hadn't rotted, barley if the harvest had been kind. In leaner times, it was mostly water flavoured with memory and wishful thinking. You added whatever you had: turnip greens, the outer leaves of vegetables too wilted to eat raw, bones that had already given up their meat, but might still remember what it tasted like. The pottage wasn't seasoned so much as flavoured by accident and necessity. A handful of herbs if you grew them, salt if you could afford it, which you usually couldn't. More often, the taste came from whatever had been cooked in the pot before, yesterday's cabbage lending a ghost of itself to today's beans, last week's chicken bone still contributing a whisper of richness to this week's turnip water. You didn't cook pottage for pleasure. You cooked it because it was warm, it was filling, and it used everything you had without wasting anything you couldn't spare. The leftovers became the base for tomorrow's meal, which became the base for the next day's meal, in an endless cycle of making do with what remained. Bread was the other cornerstone of survival, though calling it bread required a generous interpretation of the word. Dark, dense, and heavy enough to use as a weapon, it was made from whatever grain you could grow, buy, or beg. Wheat was for lords and merchants. You made do with rye, barley, oats, or, in desperate times, ground peas mixed with whatever flour-like substance you could create. The loaves were small and hard, more like edible stones than the soft golden rounds that graced richer tables. They went stale quickly and stayed stale permanently, requiring soaking in whatever liquid you had available, pottage, ale, milk if you were lucky, to become chewable again. In times of famine, bread became even more creative. Ground acorns if you could find them and process them properly to remove the bitterness. Tree bark, literally scraped from birch trees, dried, and ground into a powder that could be mixed with whatever real flour existed. The result was famine bread, bitter, heavy, and barely digestible, but it filled the stomach and might keep you alive long enough to see better times. Sometimes bread served a double purpose as trencher, thick slices used as plates to soak up stews and sauces. These bread plates were either eaten at the end of the meal or given to the animals. Nothing wasted in a world where waste was a luxury no one could afford. Meat was rare and precious, saved for feast days or emergencies that demanded protein. Your animals were more valuable alive than dead. Chickens laid eggs, cows gave milk, pigs could be bred. You didn't eat your livestock unless you were desperate or celebrating something significant enough to justify the sacrifice. When you did have meat, you used everything. Blood became pudding mixed with grain and fat. Organs were boiled into stews. Bones were cracked for marrow, then boiled for broth, then ground for meal. Nothing with nutritional value ever met the waste pile. Pork was the most common meat when it was available, since pigs were efficient converters of kitchen scraps into protein. But slaughtering a pig meant weeks of careful preservation, salting, smoking, drying, to make the meat last through the months ahead. It was an event that required planning and community cooperation. Fish offered protein if you lived near water and had permission to catch them, but many rivers and ponds belonged to the Lord, and fishing without authorization could result in fines you couldn't pay or punishments you couldn't afford. When you could fish legally, you went after anything that would take a hook, eels, small river fish, whatever bit, and could be preserved with salt if you had it. The church controlled much of your diet through its calendar of fast days. Fridays meant no meat, Lent meant weeks of restricted eating, and various saints' days required dietary observances that you followed whether you could afford to or not. Some creative interpretations helped. Beaver was classified as fish, which made certain Fridays more bearable if you could catch one. Milk was consumed when available, but didn't keep long without refrigeration that wouldn't be invented for centuries. You turned it into cheese when possible, though the process was more art than science, and the results were often harder and sharper than what you'd prefer. Butter was made when you had excess cream, though excess was relative when you only had one cow. Most of your calories came from vegetables grown in small plots outside your door. Cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, hardy plants that could survive in poor soil and unpredictable weather. Nothing was wasted. You ate the roots, the leaves, the stems, and composted only what was truly inedible. Carrots existed, though they were purple or white rather than orange, and tasted nothing like their modern descendants. Apples grew wild in some places, providing fruit in season and dried sustenance for winter if you could preserve them properly. Berries were gathered when they ripened, eaten immediately since they didn't keep well. Herbs were grown not for flavour but for medicine and preservation. Sage, thyme, rosemary. Plants that might prevent food from spoiling quite as quickly, might aid digestion, might ward off illness. If they made things taste slightly better, that was an unexpected bonus rather than the primary goal. Ale was the default beverage for everyone, including children, because water couldn't be trusted not to make you sick. Small beer with low alcohol content killed bacteria while providing some calories and nutrients. You brewed it at home in batches that were consumed quickly since it didn't store well. Meals were eaten communally around the fire, everyone sharing from the same pot, the same loaf. There were no courses, no presentation, no particular ceremony. You ladled pottage into your bowl, tore off a piece of bread, drank your ale, and concentrated on getting enough calories to fuel another day's work. Feast days brought better food, maybe a chicken roasted instead of boiled, bread made with some wheat flour mixed in, ale that was slightly stronger. But feast days were rare, marking religious holidays or family celebrations significant enough to justify using up resources you couldn't easily replace. Most days, you scraped the bowl clean, chewed the bread slowly to make it last, and told yourself you'd had enough even when you hadn't. Hunger was a constant companion that you learned to ignore, like an ache that never quite goes away but becomes part of the background noise of existence. The kitchen was never clean by modern standards, but you wiped things down and boiled what could be boiled and trusted that cooking would kill most of whatever might harm you. Food poisoning was a real threat, but so was starvation, and you made the calculations that seemed most likely to keep you alive. You went to bed with your stomach not quite full, and woke up already thinking about where the day's food would come from. It was a cycle that never really ended, a puzzle that reset itself every morning, with the same limited pieces and the same essential goal: make it through one more day with enough energy to face whatever tomorrow might require. The pot bubbled, the bread cooled, and you survived. Not comfortably, not abundantly, but you survived. And in a world where survival was never guaranteed, that was achievement enough. If you were a medieval peasant, the word ownership meant something different than it would to people in later centuries. You might live in a house you built with your own hands, work fields you'd tended for years, keep animals you'd raised from birth, but none of it was truly yours. Everything belonged to the Lord, the land, the buildings, the crops, the animals, and in a very real sense, you. You were what was called a villain, not an insult despite how it sounds, but a legal category that defined your relationship to both the land and the man who owned it. You were bound to the soil, unable to leave without permission, required to work the Lord's fields before your own, obligated to give a portion of everything you produced to a man you rarely saw, but whose presence dominated every aspect of your life. The Lord himself might be a knight, a baron, a minor noble who had inherited or been granted this particular patch of countryside, He probably lived in a manor house that seemed impossibly grand compared to your mud and thatch cottage, though it would appear modest next to the castles of more important men. He ate better food, wore finer clothes, and slept in a bed that didn't collapse when he turned over. But you didn't deal with the Lord directly. That would have been presumptuous, like expecting to have a conversation with the sun. Instead, you dealt with his steward, a man who kept records, collected rents, and made sure everyone understood exactly what they owed and when they owed it. The steward arrived regularly with his ledgers and his questions, recording everything: how much grain you'd harvested, how many eggs your chickens had laid, whether your pig had produced a litter worth counting. He didn't care about your problems: sick children, roof leaks, cows that had stopped giving milk. He cared about numbers, about making sure the Lord received his proper share of everything. And that share was substantial. You owed corvée labour, several days each week working the Lord's fields instead of your own. During harvest time, this might extend to most of your waking hours, leaving you to tend your own crops by moonlight, or not at all. You received nothing for this labour except the privilege of being allowed to continue living on land that wasn't yours. Beyond labour, you owed rent in kind, a portion of your grain, your wool, your cheese, your ale. If you kept bees, you owed honey. If you caught fish, you owed fish. If your cow had a calf, the Lord had first claim on it. These weren't taxes in the modern sense, but obligations that came with existing. The Lord controlled more than just your produce. Want to grind your grain? You had to use his mill and pay for the privilege, even though using any other mill, if one existed, was forbidden. Want to bake your bread? His oven, his fee. Want to brew ale? His equipment, his percentage. The monopolies were total and non-negotiable. Marriage required the Lord's permission and usually a fee. Inheritance meant more fees. Moving to another village, if such a thing were even possible, required permission that was rarely granted, and fees that were rarely affordable. You were bound to this place and this system from birth to death, with very few ways to break free. What did you get in return for all these obligations? Theoretically, protection. If bandits attacked, if rival nobles invaded, if disaster struck, the Lord was supposed to defend you and provide aid. In practice, this protection was often theoretical at best. The Lord's men-at-arms were few in number, and not always nearby when needed. The manor system created a hierarchy that everyone understood, even if they didn't like it. At the top sat the Lord, owing service to his own superior in an endless chain that eventually reached the king. Below him were free peasants, if any existed in your area, then villains like yourself, then serfs who had even fewer rights, then at the bottom, landless labourers who worked for daily bread. You knew your place in this system and stayed in it, not from choice but from necessity. Rebellion wasn't just dangerous, it was practically impossible. The Lord had soldiers, the church supported the existing order, and the law, such as it was, favoured those who owned land over those who merely worked it. The manor court handled disputes and dispensed justice, though justice was often synonymous with whatever served the Lord's interests. If your neighbour's pig rooted up your garden, if someone stole your tools, if there was an argument about boundaries, the court might settle it, for a fee, of course. The Lord or his representative served as judge, jury, and beneficiary of whatever fines were imposed. Even death didn't end your obligations. When you died, your best animal or most valuable possession went to the Lord as a heriot, a death duty that supposedly compensated him for losing a worker. Your family inherited your debts along with your hovel and your small plot of land, ensuring that the cycle continued into the next generation. The system was justified by tradition, religion, and the simple fact that it had always been this way. The church taught that social hierarchy reflected divine will. God had made lords to rule and peasants to serve, and questioning this arrangement was tantamount to questioning God himself. The priests who delivered these sermons were usually supported by the same lords who benefited from peasant labour, yet the relationship wasn't entirely one-sided, though the balance was heavily tilted. The Lord needed peasants to work his land, just as peasants needed land to work. This mutual dependence created a system that was stable, if not fair. You knew what was expected of you, and the Lord knew he could count on your labour and tribute. Occasionally a lord might show generosity. remitting fees during a particularly hard year, providing grain during famine, allowing extra time to complete required labour. These gestures weren't kindness so much as practical management, ensuring that his workforce survived to continue producing value. But they were appreciated nonetheless, creating a complex mixture of resentment and gratitude. The manor was its own small world with its own rules, its own economy, its own systems of reward and punishment. Most of what was produced was consumed locally, grain ground at the manor mill, cloth woven from manor sheep, ale brewed from manor barley. Money was rarely used. Most transactions were in goods, services and obligations. You lived your entire life within this system, watching the Lord's fields being harvested while your own waited, seeing the best of your produce carted away to the manor house while you made do with what remained. It bred a particular kind of patience, the patience of people who had learned that resistance was futile, but endurance was possible. The Lord might change, dying, moving away, selling his holdings, but the system remained. New Lord, same obligations, different face, same ledgers. The manor endured while individuals came and went, a machine that ground on regardless of who fed it or who benefited from it. And so, you bent your back and bent your knee and called it normal, because normal was what kept you alive. You saved your small rebellions for private moments, a muttered curse when the steward wasn't listening, a handful of grain hidden from the count, a joke shared with neighbours about the Lord's latest foolishness. The great wheel turned, season after season, year after year, grinding the same grain, producing the same results. You were part of that wheel, neither its hub nor its rim, but one of the countless spokes that kept it moving. It wasn't a comfortable position, but it was yours, and it was all you had ever known. Disease in medieval times wasn't an event that interrupted normal life. It was woven into the fabric of daily existence like hunger, cold, and exhaustion. You lived with the constant awareness that your body could betray you at any moment, that a small cut could fester, a brief fever could become a death sentence, that waking up healthy was never guaranteed. There were no hospitals in the modern sense, no trained doctors making house calls, no pharmacies stocked with remedies that actually worked. If you were fortunate, your village had a wise woman who knew which plants might help and which would make things worse. If you were extremely lucky, there might be a monastery nearby with monks who could read Latin medical texts that were centuries out of date and often wrong to begin with. Most of the time, when illness struck, you simply endured it at home. You lay in your straw mattress, shared the same air with your entire family, and hoped that whatever was wrong with you wouldn't spread to everyone else. Recovery was a matter of luck, constitution, and whether your body could outlast whatever was attacking it. The causes of disease were mysterious, and the explanations were often worse than useless. Many believed in miasma, the idea that bad air carried sickness. This led to people stuffing herbs in their clothing, carrying bundles of flowers, or soaking rags in vinegar to breathe through. None of it worked, but it gave people something to do besides wait and worry. Others blamed divine punishment. Illness was seen as God's way of testing the faithful or punishing the wicked. If your child fell sick, it might be because of some sin you'd committed or failed to confess. If an entire village was struck down, it was clearly a sign of collective moral decay. The solution was more prayer, more penance, more offerings to the church. Local superstitions filled in the gaps. Some believed disease came from the evil eye. A jealous neighbour's glance could literally make you sick. Others blamed lunar phases, cursed objects, or vengeful spirits of the dead. One particularly persistent belief was that illness entered through the feet, leading to elaborate rituals involving boiling water and burning herbs around the threshold of homes. The remedies were often as dangerous as the diseases they purported to cure. Bloodletting was common, the idea being that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily humours that could be corrected by draining blood. Local barbers or travelling surgeons would arrive with sharp instruments and bowls, opening veins and hoping for the best. Many patients died not from their original ailment, but from the loss of blood that was supposed to heal them. Herbal remedies ranged from occasionally helpful to actively harmful. Willow bark tea might actually reduce fever, but ground mercury was also prescribed for various ailments, slowly poisoning patients even as it promised to cure them. Poultices made from bread, mud, or animal dung were applied to wounds, often introducing more infection than they prevented. For internal problems, the cures grew even stranger. Crushed pearls mixed with wine for stomach ailments. Powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, for poisoning. Live spiders swallowed whole for fever. Ground human skull for epilepsy. The more exotic and expensive the remedy, the more faith people placed in its power. Religious remedies were equally popular and equally ineffective. Holy relics, bones, teeth, scraps of cloth supposedly touched by saints, were pressed against diseased bodies. Pilgrimages were undertaken to sacred sites known for miraculous healings. Water blessed by priests was drunk or used to bathe infected areas. These treatments provided comfort and hope, but rarely actual healing. The arrival of plague in the 14th century revealed just how helpless medieval medicine truly was. The Black Death killed with such speed and efficiency that none of the traditional remedies had time to fail. People simply died before anyone could try to save them. Entire villages were wiped out in weeks. Survivors stumbled through empty streets, stepping over bodies that had been neighbours just days before. Some tried to flee the plague, packing what they could carry and heading for distant relatives or rumoured safe havens. But disease travelled faster than refugees, and the roads were littered with the bodies of people who had died trying to escape death. Others turned to extreme religious practices, public flagellation, mass confessions, violent persecution of outsiders, blamed for bringing the pestilence. The Church's response was characteristically unhelpful. Priests declared the plague God's punishment for humanity's sins, demanding increased donations and more fervent prayer. When prayer failed to stop the dying, they blamed insufficient faith or hidden wickedness. Some clergy fled their parishes, while others stayed and died alongside their congregants, their martyrdom serving as proof of divine displeasure rather than medical incompetence. Those who survived developed a fatalistic relationship with illness. They accepted sickness as part of life's natural rhythm, no more surprising than bad weather or poor harvests. Children learned to recognize the signs of serious illness, the particular pallor that meant death was near, the way breathing changed in the final hours, the sound of a cough that wouldn't get better. Families developed their own traditions for dealing with disease. Certain prayers were said over the sick. Specific herbs were burned in the fireplace. Lucky charms were placed under pillows. None of it worked in any measurable way, but it gave people agency in situations where they were otherwise powerless. The lucky ones recovered and lived to face another day of backbreaking labour. The unlucky ones were buried in shallow graves with minimal ceremony. Resources couldn't be wasted on elaborate funerals when there was barely enough food for the living. Their possessions were distributed among surviving family members. Their debts passed on to their children. Their place in the fields taken by whoever was strong enough to hold a plough. Disease was the great equalizer in a world already short on equality. It struck rich and poor alike, though the poor died more often and more miserably. They had less food to sustain them through illness, worse housing to recover in, and no access to what few genuine remedies existed. Their children died more frequently, their mothers died in childbirth more often, their elders died younger than those who could afford better care. Yet somehow, life continued. People married despite the risk of widowhood, had children despite infant mortality, planned for futures they might not live to see. They developed a kind of resigned courage, facing each day with the knowledge that it might be their last, but refusing to let that possibility paralyze them. The medieval peasants' relationship with disease was ultimately one of endurance rather than conquest. They couldn't cure most illnesses, couldn't prevent epidemics, couldn't protect their loved ones from the random cruelties of biology, but they could witness suffering without abandoning hope, could tend the sick without guarantee of success, could bury the dead and continue living, in a world where medicine was largely mythology and survival was mostly luck. That kind of stubborn persistence was perhaps the only real cure they had. Night in the medieval countryside was not darkness, softened by electric lights or warmed by central heating. It was complete, absolute, intimidating darkness that pressed against your windows like a living thing. When the sun disappeared behind the hills, the world didn't fade gently into twilight. It simply ended, replaced by a black void filled with sounds you couldn't identify and fears you couldn't name. There was no artificial light to speak of. Candles were precious, made from expensive beeswax or stinking tallow, saved for emergencies or special occasions. Oil lamps required oil, which required money, which you rarely had. Most nights, once the fire died down to glowing coals, you lived by memory and faith, navigating your own home by feel and hope. Sleep came not in the long, uninterrupted stretches that modern people consider normal, but in segments. You would fall asleep shortly after dark, exhausted from a day of physical labour, then wake naturally in the middle of the night for what was called the watching time. This wasn't insomnia. It was the normal pattern of human rest before artificial lighting changed everything. During these midnight hours, the world belonged to different rules. Some people prayed, others tended the fire, many simply lay quietly and listened to the night sounds. It was a time for reflection, for intimate conversations whispered in darkness, for the kind of thoughts that only came when the busy day had finally stopped demanding attention. Everyone slept together, not by choice but by necessity. Your single room housed parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes neighbours whose own homes had become uninhabitable. Privacy was a concept that belonged to wealthy people with multiple rooms and servants to guard them. You learned to sleep through snoring, coughing, crying, and the countless small sounds of people living in too close proximity. The bed itself was often shared by multiple family members, parents and young children, siblings of various ages, elderly relatives who needed help staying warm. Mattresses were stuffed with straw that harboured fleas and mice, covered with blankets that were never quite clean and never quite dry. You slept in your clothes, because undressing was impractical when you shared sleeping space with half the village. Animals often joined the household at night. A cow or goat might be brought inside during harsh weather. Chickens roosted in baskets near the fire. Dogs and cats claimed whatever warm spots they could find. The combination of human and animal breath created a fog that hung in the air, thick with the scent of bodies that bathed infrequently and worked constantly. The cold was your constant enemy. It seeped through walls made of mud and straw, crept under doors that fit poorly, dropped through holes in the thatch where the wind found its way inside. You went to bed wearing every piece of clothing you owned, huddled under wool blankets that scratched your skin but trapped what little body heat you produced. Fear was as much a part of night as darkness itself. The forest pressed close to your village, full of genuine dangers, wolves, bears, wild boar, and imagined ones that seemed equally real in the black hours before dawn. Bandits used the cover of darkness to move unseen. Fires could start from a neglected ember and consume everything you owned before you woke to fight them. Supernatural fears were just as pressing as natural ones. Ghosts walked at midnight, or so everyone believed. Evil spirits slipped through cracks in walls and windows, seeking souls to steal or bodies to possess. Witches flew overhead on their way to diabolic gatherings. The devil himself was said to be more active after sunset, when good Christians were supposed to be safely asleep and protected by prayer. You developed rituals to guard against these threats. Iron objects placed by the door to repel evil spirits. Herbs hung above windows to discourage supernatural visitors. Prayers muttered before sleep to secure divine protection through the vulnerable hours. These precautions probably didn't work, but they made the darkness feel slightly less menacing. Dreams during medieval sleep were considered significant, possibly prophetic. The church taught that God sometimes spoke through dreams, but so did the devil. Learning to interpret your dreams correctly was a matter of spiritual survival. Dreaming of water might mean purification or drowning. Animals could represent virtues or sins. Dead relatives might bring warnings or blessings. The wise women of the village often served as dream interpreters, helping people understand what their sleeping minds were trying to tell them. A dream of fire might mean passion or destruction, depending on the context. Flying could indicate spiritual elevation or demonic influence. The symbols were complex, contradictory, and deeply believed. Waking up was often uncertain. Was that sound outside human or animal? Was that shadow moving naturally or with malevolent purpose? You lay still, listening, until you could identify the source of whatever had disturbed your rest. More often than not, it was nothing threatening, just the wind, or a loose shutter, or one of the animals shifting position. Morning came not with alarm clocks, but with roosters, if you were lucky enough to have them. The first hint of light in the sky was your signal to begin another day, regardless of how much sleep you'd actually gotten. You stirred the fire back to life, checked on family members and animals, began the endless cycle of tasks that filled medieval days. Winter nights were the worst, long, cold, and filled with the sounds of people trying to stay warm in inadequate shelter. You rationed firewood carefully, knowing that running out meant facing the worst weather with no heat at all. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat and breath, creating small islands of life in the vast, cold darkness. Summer brought different challenges. Nights were shorter, but filled with insects that bit and buzzed and made sleep difficult. The smell of unwashed bodies and animal waste became overwhelming in the heat. Fleas multiplied in the warm weather, making everyone scratch and shift restlessly through the brief hours of darkness. Yet for all its discomforts and fears, night also brought a kind of peace that was impossible during the busy daylight hours. The work stopped, the demands ceased, and for a few hours you could simply exist without having to produce or achieve anything. Conversations happened in darkness that would never occur in daylight. Intimacies were shared that the harsh light of day would have made impossible. Children learned to sleep through almost anything. Their parents' conversations, the animals' noises, the wind rattling the thatch. They developed the ability to fall asleep anywhere, any time, a skill that would serve them well in a life that offered few comfortable resting places. When someone died during the night, everyone knew immediately. The quality of sleep changed, breathing patterns altered, and families woke to the terrible silence where a voice had been just hours before. These midnight deaths were particularly frightening because they suggested that sleep itself was dangerous, that letting your guard down could invite forces you couldn't control. The rhythm of two sleep became as natural as breathing. First sleep, midnight waking, second sleep, then dawn. It divided the night into manageable pieces, made the long hours of darkness feel less overwhelming. You knew that even in the deepest night, morning would eventually come, bringing light and warmth and the familiar comfort of visible dangers you could actually address. Night sounds became a language you learned to read. The wind in the thatch meant weather changes. Animal noises indicated their comfort or distress. Human sounds from neighbouring houses suggested everything was normal, or that something was wrong. Silence was often more frightening than noise because it suggested something had happened that shouldn't have. Religious observances marked certain night hours, midnight prayers for the especially devout, bedtime rituals that asked for protection through the dark hours, morning prayers that gave thanks for surviving another night intact. The church taught that night was a time of spiritual vulnerability, when souls were more susceptible to evil influences. As winter gradually gave way to spring, the nights shortened and the fear lessened slightly. But it never disappeared entirely, because you never knew what the next darkness might bring. Sickness, death, fire, violence, all were more likely to strike when people were helpless and vulnerable in sleep. You went to bed each night, not knowing if you would wake up, but trusting that morning would find you still breathing, still able to face another day of small struggles and large hopes. The darkness was vast and full of uncertainty, but it was also temporary. Dawn always came eventually, bringing with it the modest comfort of surviving one more night in a world that never guaranteed tomorrow. Some years brought hunger, others brought famine. The difference was the space between discomfort and desperation, between tightening your belt and wondering if you would live long enough to harvest the crops you couldn't afford to plant. Famine didn't announce itself with dramatic fanfare. It crept in quietly, revealed first in the fields where crops grew stunted and yellow, where rain came too early or too late or not at all. You noticed it in the way your neighbours' faces grew gaunt, in the silence where children's laughter used to echo, in the careful way people counted every grain of barley as if each kernel might be the one that kept them alive another day. The progression was always the same, predictable as the seasons but far less welcome. First, the portions grew smaller. The bread was cut thinner, the stew stretched with more water and less substance. You told yourself it was temporary, that the next harvest would be better, that somehow there would be enough to carry everyone through. Then the animals began to disappear. Not stolen, but slaughtered out of necessity. The chickens first. They ate grain you couldn't spare and produced eggs too infrequently to justify feeding them. Then the goats, the pig if you had one, finally even the cow whose milk had been keeping the children from starving outright. Each death meant more meat than you'd seen in months, but also the end of future production. As autumn turned to winter, the calculations became starker. How many days until spring? How much grain remained? How many mouths were counting on supplies that were already insufficient? You learned to ration not just food, but hope itself, measuring out optimism like precious salt, making it last as long as possible. The village grew quiet in ways that had nothing to do with snow or cold. People stopped gathering in the evenings to share stories and ale. Children no longer ran between houses, playing games that required energy they couldn't spare. Even arguments became rare. Fighting took strength that everyone needed to conserve for survival. Your body began to change in subtle ways that became more obvious as the months wore on. You noticed your ribs more prominently, felt the sharpness of hip bones when you lay down to sleep. Your clothes hung looser, your face looked hollow, your hands shook slightly when you tried to perform delicate tasks. The constant gnawing in your stomach became background noise, as familiar as your own heartbeat. Sleep became elusive despite exhaustion. Hunger had its own rhythm that didn't respect your need for rest. You would drift off, then wake a few hours later with cramps that twisted through your belly like living things. Sometimes you dreamed of food so vividly that waking felt like a second starvation. Yet somehow, even in the worst times, moments of generosity emerged that shone like candles in the darkness. A family with slightly more would share their last loaf with neighbours who had nothing. Children received the choicest portions, while adults claimed they weren't hungry. Old people insisted the young eat first, calculating their own survival against the community's future. The church's role during famine was complicated and contradictory. Priests preached about divine providence while their own bellies stayed fuller than most. The wealthy landowners who controlled grain stores might distribute charity, but always at a price: labour, loyalty, sometimes simple humiliation. You learned to bow deeper, speak softer, accept whatever terms were offered, because the alternative was watching your family starve. Disease followed famine like a faithful dog. Bodies weakened by hunger couldn't fight off infections that might normally be minor inconveniences. A simple cold became pneumonia. A small cut refused to heal. Childbirth became even more dangerous than usual, and children born during famine years often died within months, their mothers too malnourished to produce adequate milk. The worst famines lasted multiple years, grinding through communities like enormous millstones. The first year, people ate their seed grain, gambling that next season would bring better weather. When it didn't, there was nothing left to plant, and the cycle of starvation became self-perpetuating. Villages that had existed for generations simply emptied, their inhabitants scattered to the winds or buried in shallow graves. Some tried to flee, loading whatever possessions they could carry and walking toward rumours of better conditions elsewhere. The roads filled with hollow-eyed families pushing handcarts, loaded with children too weak to walk. Most never reached their destinations. The fortunate ones found work as labourers in places where the harvest had been slightly better. The unlucky became cautionary tales, their bones marking paths that other refugees learned to avoid. Those who stayed developed a grim expertise in making the inedible edible. Tree bark was stripped, dried, and ground into flour that produced bread bitter enough to make you gag, but filling enough to quiet the worst hunger. Leather belts and shoes were boiled into soup that provided some nutrition and the illusion of substance. Grass, roots, anything that could be chewed and swallowed became potential food. The wealthy survived famine more easily than the poor, but they didn't escape it entirely. Their granaries, no matter how well stocked, eventually emptied. Their servants and soldiers needed feeding, and hungry men with weapons were dangerous companions. Some lords found their authority crumbling along with their food supplies, their commands carrying less weight, than promises of bread. Children bore the worst of famine's cruelties. Their growing bodies needed more nutrition than was available, and they lacked the experience to understand why their parents could no longer provide what had once seemed limitless. They stopped playing, stopped laughing, stopped asking for things they knew weren't available. Their silence was more heartbreaking than their cries would have been. Women faced particular hardships during famine years. Pregnancy became terrifying, childbirth often fatal. Nursing mothers watched their milk dry up, leaving infants to starve despite their mother's desperate love. The physical demands of daily life continued, even as nutrition disappeared, requiring strength that no longer existed. Men struggled with their inability to provide for their families. The traditional roles that defined masculinity, protector, provider, authority, became meaningless when there was nothing to provide and no strength left to protect with. Some became violent, lashing out at circumstances they couldn't control. Others retreated into themselves, conserving energy and emotion for the basic task of staying alive. The end of famine, when it came, didn't arrive with celebration, but with cautious, almost disbelieving relief. The first good harvest after years of failure seemed miraculous, but trust took longer to rebuild than the granaries. People hoarded grain long after abundance returned, remembering too clearly what it felt like to count kernels like coins. Recovery was slow and incomplete. The dead couldn't return, the scattered families couldn't always reunite, the community bonds strained by desperation needed time to heal. Some villages never fully recovered their pre-famine populations, their empty houses serving as monuments to hungers that had finally claimed their victims. Those who survived carried the memory of famine like a scar that ached in certain weather. They learned to appreciate abundance without trusting it, to enjoy plenty while remembering scarcity. Their children grew up hearing stories of the hungry years, learning to waste nothing and save everything against the possibility that such times might come again. Famine taught brutal lessons about the fragility of human existence, the thin margin between life and death, the speed with which abundance could transform into starvation. It revealed both the worst and best of human nature, the capacity for cruelty born of desperation, but also the ability to share final crusts with their starving neighbours. The survivors didn't emerge unchanged. They carried a different relationship with food, with security, with the future itself. They had looked into the face of mortality and seen their own reflection, had learned that survival was never guaranteed and always came at a cost that someone, somewhere, would have to pay. Yet they continued to plant crops, bear children, build houses, and make plans that assumed tomorrow would come. This stubborn optimism in the face of experienced catastrophe was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval resilience, the ability to hope, despite evidence, to invest in futures they had learned could vanish overnight. The fields that had failed them still needed tending. The communities that had nearly dissolved still required rebuilding. Life, persistent and demanding, called them back from the edge of extinction and asked them to try again, knowing that famine was always waiting somewhere in the future, patient as death itself. In a world where the church's authority was absolute and unquestionable, your spiritual life wasn't a matter of personal choice, but a system of obligations that began before birth and extended beyond death. The Christian faith didn't just provide comfort and meaning. It controlled time, regulated behavior, demanded payment, and promised both salvation and damnation with equal certainty. Your baptism happened within days of your birth, marking your entry not just into the world, but into a vast network of spiritual debts and expectations. The priest spoke Latin words over your infant head that you would never understand, claimed your soul for Christ before you could walk or speak, and entered your name in records that connected you to a church hierarchy, stretching across continents and centuries. The village priest was often the only literate person for miles around, making him not just your spiritual guide, but your connection to the written world. He read the Latin Bible that contained truths you were expected to accept without understanding. He interpreted divine will through sermons that mixed theology with gossip, moral instruction with practical advice about when to plant crops and how to treat sick animals. Mass was conducted in a language that might as well have been magic spells for all the sense it made to peasant ears. You stood in the cold stone church listening to syllables that carried enormous significance, but no comprehensible meaning. The priest's gestures were precise, the rituals ancient, the atmosphere heavy with incense, and the weight of traditions that stretched back beyond memory. You learned to respond at the appropriate moments, not because you understood what was being said, but because everyone else was responding. The rhythm of Latin became familiar, even when the meaning remained mysterious. You crossed yourself when others did, knelt when the crowd knelt, murmured Amen when the tone suggested it was expected. The church calendar ruled your life more thoroughly than any Lord's demands. Advent, Lent, Easter, Pentecost. These weren't just religious observances, but practical matters that determined what you could eat, when you could work, how you should behave. The calendar of saints' days provided structure to the year, giving meaning to dates that would otherwise be just another sunrise in an endless series. Confession was mandatory, not voluntary. You were required to examine your conscience and reveal your sins to the priest, who served as God's representative on earth. The privacy of the confessional didn't exist yet. You confessed publicly or semi-publicly, admitting your failures before the community that would judge you for them. The sins you confessed were often small, pathetic things that revealed more about medieval life than about cosmic evil. You had envied your neighbour's better harvest. You had eaten meat on a fast day when no one was looking. You had felt anger toward the Lord's steward. You had missed morning prayers because you were too tired to rise with the dawn. Penance was practical as well as spiritual. The priest might require you to say specific prayers, make a pilgrimage to a local shrine, donate grain to the church, or perform additional labour for the community. The punishment was supposed to cleanse your soul, but it also served to reinforce social control and church authority. The concept of purgatory added complexity to death that made life more anxious. Your soul might not go directly to heaven or hell, but could spend centuries in an intermediate state of purification. The time you spent in purgatory could be reduced through prayers, good works, and payments made on your behalf by surviving family members. This meant that dying was expensive for those left behind. Your relatives were expected to pay for masses to be said for your soul, to light candles in your memory, to make donations that would supposedly ease your passage through the afterlife. The church provided detailed calculations about how much prayer and payment were needed to spring a soul from purgatorial imprisonment. Saints served as intermediaries between your desperate needs and divine indifference. There were saints for every possible problem: Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Isidore for farmers, Saint Sebastian for plague victims. You didn't need to understand the theology behind saint veneration. You just needed to know which name to call when crisis struck. Relics were physical connections to divine power, fragments of saints' bodies or objects they had touched that supposedly retained miraculous properties. A tooth, a fingernail, a scrap of clothing, these became treasures more valuable than gold, capable of healing the sick and protecting the faithful. The trade in relics was enormous and almost entirely fraudulent, but faith made fraud irrelevant. Pilgrimage offered the chance to earn spiritual merit while escaping the familiar boundaries of village life. Walking to distant shrines was supposed to demonstrate devotion, but it also provided adventure, companionship, and stories to tell for years afterward. The journey was often more significant than the destination, creating temporary communities of travellers bound by shared hardship and common purpose. The church building itself was the most impressive structure most peasants ever entered. Stone walls, arched ceilings, coloured glass windows, architecture that dwarfed human scale and suggested divine grandeur. The interior was decorated with paintings and carvings that told biblical stories to people who couldn't read, creating a visual catechism that reinforced church teachings. Tithes weren't suggestions, but mandatory taxes that claimed 1/10 of everything you produced. Grain, eggs, wool, livestock, the church's share came off the top, before you fed your family or paid other obligations. The tithe barn in every village was usually larger and better constructed than any peasant dwelling, a visible reminder of where true wealth accumulated. Religious festivals provided the only legitimate breaks from constant labour, but even celebration was regulated by church authority. Christmas, Easter, and various saints' days allowed for feasting, drinking, and entertainment, but always within bounds defined by clergy, who remained suspicious of too much joy among the faithful. The Church taught that suffering was spiritually valuable, that poverty was blessed, that obedience to authority reflected divine will. This theology provided comfort to people whose lives contained more suffering than joy, but it also discouraged resistance to social conditions that kept peasants subordinate to their betters. Marriage required church blessing and followed church rules about who could wed whom, when marriages could take place, and what obligations spouses owed each other. Divorce didn't exist. Marriage was permanent, regardless of abuse, incompatibility, or changed circumstances. The Church's control over marriage gave it power over family formation and inheritance patterns. Even work was regulated by religious considerations. Certain jobs were considered more sinful than others. Usury, lending money at interest, was forbidden, though exceptions were made for those with enough wealth to navigate around the restrictions. Craftsmen organized themselves into guilds that combined economic interests with religious devotion. Death rituals were elaborate and expensive, designed to ensure proper passage into the afterlife, while extracting maximum payment from grieving families. The funeral mass, burial in consecrated ground, prayers for the deceased, all came with fees that could bankrupt survivors who were already struggling to survive without their dead relatives' labour. The Church promised paradise but delivered obligations. It offered salvation but demanded payment. It provided community but enforced conformity. It gave meaning to suffering while perpetuating the conditions that cause suffering. The contradiction was built into the system. Spiritual freedom through earthly bondage, heavenly reward through worldly submission. Yet for all its contradictions and costs, the Church did provide genuine comfort to people whose lives offered little of it elsewhere. The promise of eventual justice, the hope of reunion with dead loved ones, the belief that suffering had purpose, these weren't small consolations for people who had little else to sustain them. Prayer was the one luxury that poverty couldn't take away. You might have no food, no warmth, no security, but you could still speak to God, still hope for divine intervention, still believe that someone beyond the visible world cared about your struggles. The Church might tax your prayer through required offerings, but it couldn't entirely control the conversation between your desperate soul and whatever divine presence you hoped was listening. The bells that marked canonical hours, morning prayer, midday reflection, evening devotion, provided rhythm to days that might otherwise have seemed endless and pointless. The sound of church bells carried across fields and forests, reminding scattered communities that they belonged to something larger than their individual struggles. In the end, you served the Church because you had no choice, but you also found in that service a framework that made sense of senseless suffering, a community that extended beyond your physical neighbours, a hope that transcended the limitations of your brief and difficult life. The weight of religious obligation was heavy, but without it, the weight of existence itself might have been unbearable. The Church took much, but it also gave meaning to the taking. It demanded sacrifice, but promised that sacrifice would be rewarded. It controlled your life, but also provided a reason why that life mattered. In a world where so little was certain, that was worth the price of admission, however steep that price might be. You might assume that people who endured so much hardship, who faced such relentless exploitation and casual cruelty, would rise up more often. That the accumulated weight of suffering would eventually snap the bonds of feudalism and send peasants streaming toward their lords with torches and farm tools, demanding justice, or at least revenge. But rebellion was rare, brief, and almost always unsuccessful. The great peasant revolts that historians remember, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie, scattered uprisings across Germany and the Low Countries, were exceptions that proved the rule. Most peasants, most of the time, endured their circumstances without organised resistance, not because they accepted injustice, but because rebellion was a luxury they couldn't afford. Understanding why requires thinking like someone whose entire world consists of the next harvest, the next meal, the next day's survival. Revolution is an abstract concept that requires leisure to contemplate and security to risk. When your children are hungry, and your roof is leaking and your Lord's steward is demanding payment you don't have, planning an uprising falls somewhere below mending thatch and finding food on your list of priorities. The practical obstacles to rebellion were enormous. Peasants lived scattered across the countryside, isolated in villages that might be days apart. Communication was slow, unreliable, and dangerous. Carrying messages between communities meant travelling roads where you might be robbed, questioned by authorities, or simply disappear without trace. Organising resistance required coordination that the geography and technology of medieval life made nearly impossible. Even within individual villages, solidarity was complicated by competing interests and ancient grudges. Your neighbour might share your hatred of excessive taxes, but he also competed with you for access to the common pasture, owed you money from last spring's seed loan, and had never forgiven you for the argument about boundary stones that happened 5 years ago. Building unity among people who lived in such intimate, fractious proximity was like trying to herd cats, who had personal vendettas against each other. The lords had weapons, training, and legal authority that peasants lacked. A handful of knights could slaughter dozens of farmers armed with pitchforks and sickles. The manor house wasn't just a residence, but a fortress, designed to withstand assault by people who had no siege equipment and no military experience. Even successful initial attacks could be reversed quickly when professional soldiers arrived to restore order. The church provided ideological support for the existing system that was harder to overcome than physical force. Priests preached that social hierarchy reflected God's will, that peasants were meant to serve and lords were meant to rule, that rebellion against earthly authority was rebellion against divine order. These weren't just sermons, but deeply internalized beliefs that made resistance feel like sin rather than justice. The penalties for failed rebellion were designed to discourage future attempts. Leaders were executed publicly, their bodies displayed as warnings. Participants faced fines, imprisonment, mutilation, or death. Entire communities could be punished for the actions of a few rebels, creating powerful incentives for neighbours to turn in troublemakers rather than support them. But, perhaps more importantly, the system provided just enough hope and just enough flexibility to make revolution seem unnecessary. A lord might occasionally reduce rents during a bad harvest year. The church might forgive some tithes during times of exceptional hardship. A steward might look the other way when peasants bent the rules slightly. These small gestures of mercy prevented desperation from turning into despair. The few rebellions that did occur usually happened when these safety valves failed completely, when lords pushed beyond traditional limits, or when external crises made normal